So the lender thinks that his check was deposited for $45,000 when in fact it was my check that was deposited for $45,000. Hey, this is Matt Cox, and I wanted to do like a quick story. So about real estate. It's basically about a real estate transaction. And I'm only mentioning this because I have a buddy who is a pilot with, with Spirit Airlines. I don't want to say his name. He might get upset. Anyway, so he flew into town the other day and we went and had lunch, right? And we were driving by a property that I used to own. And so I told him this story about I was like, oh yeah, it's funny. It's funny because the property's not there. They actually bulldozed. It was a vacant lot. And I was telling him, I said, that vacant lot over there, I said, I used to own a house on that I rehabbed and flipped it. And he said, he goes, oh, who'd you sell to? I said, I sold it to a lawyer. And I started explaining the whole thing. Well, when I was done with the explanation of how I got the house and the whole thing, when I finished up, he goes, bro, you need to tell that story. He said, that's actually super interesting. And I went, are you serious? Like, I didn't really think it was interesting. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, bro. It's like, it's how this worked and that worked. I think it'd be interesting the way you structured that whole deal. He was actually pretty cool. He was actually pretty interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and tell that story real quick. And here's what happened. This would have been back in, so this is in Tampa, Florida, in an area of town that was next to the Crosstown Expressway. And you don't know Tampa, but that's an important detail. So on one side of Crosstown Expressway, Crosstown Expressway is essentially, it's an interstate. It's a private interstate. It's a pay road, but a toll road. What am I saying? A toll road. Anyway, so on one side of it is an area called Old Hyde Park, which houses that, let's say a 2,000 square foot house, or 1,000 square foot house, they're appraising for $300,000-$400,000. You can get a 1,000 square foot house, which is tiny, and it can appraise for $400,000. You get 2,000 might be going for $500,000, might be going for $800,000 or $1 million. And shoot, the closer you get to the bay, because this is wedged in between the interstate, the Crosstown Expressway, and the actual Bay Area, the actual bay. The closer you get to the bay, the more these things are going for $2, $3, $4, $5 million. But my point is that this is back in 2002, I would say. And at that time, I owned a mortgage company. I was flipping houses and I was doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, I'm running real estate scams. I'm doing it's just a nightmare. Anyway, I was just being complete knucklehead. So what ended up happening was this. I'm flipping properties. I would borrow money from hard money lenders, which I've actually have a video about hard money lenders. And I would borrow money from hard money lenders because I don't want to buy a property for 100 or 200 or 50 or whatever and then put my own money into it. I don't want to put my own money into it. I'd rather borrow the money. So if something goes wrong, it's his problem. So it frees up your liquidity to do other things with your money. Here's what happened is we used to borrow money from this guy all the time named Larry Balin. It was Balin Lending, and he used to invest money for there's a pension fund that I believe was connected to his law firm. He worked for some large law firm, and that was one of the ways that they invested their pension money. So Balin, I'd borrowed a ton of money from him. So one day Balin calls up, he ends up talking to one of my partners, and my partner didn't want to do whatever Balin was talking about. And I heard him tell Balin he wasn't interested. I said, well, what did Balin want? He goes, oh, he's got these 2 houses for sale. And so I call up Balin. I said, well, you just called up Robert and he said he wasn't interested in the houses. What's going on? And he goes, look, I foreclosed on these 2 properties. I want $40,000 for each property. And I said, well, where are they? He gave me the addresses. And I said, oh man, let me go look at them. So I drove by and I looked at both of them. One of the properties was wedged up right against the interstate, right against the Crosstown Expressway. And I mean wedged up, like literally the dirt that comes off, the mound that comes off of the crosstown, like ended right at this house. I mean, you could hear the cars whipping by, but it was on the correct side of Old Hyde Park. And it was only about 1,200, 1,300 square feet. Tiny. He wants $40,000 for it. Listen, the fleas in this place were so bad when I walked into the house with my blue jeans, it looked like when I walked in and came back out, it actually looked like I had been walking in mud. That's how bad the flea infestation of this house was. It was disgusting. So, I mean, you're just, bam, just knocking off fleas, just thick with fleas. I don't know where you live, if you have a flea problem, but fleas are bad in Florida. So I beat off my pants and I get in my car and I call Balin, and then I go look at the other house, and the other house is actually pretty good size. It was actually the main house was probably, I don't know, I want to say it was probably 1,800 square feet. It was a decent sized house. And it had a little upstairs too that was like 200 square feet, 300 square feet, a little tiny 1 bedroom. It was really an efficiency, more like an efficiency, that it had a kitchen, bathroom, and a bedroom. So there's really an efficiency, not a 1 bedroom. And you got to it. It was basically a duplex, a top and bottom duplex. And I looked at the place, and it was on the other side of the interstate. So I was like, okay. But both of these properties were within quarter of a mile to half a mile from from houses in Old Hyde Park. So I call up Balin. I said, listen, man, I said, I'll take the houses, but the one that's right up against the interstate, I won't pay $40,000 for it. I'll do $30,000, and you have to finance it 100%. He says, no problem. I said, the other one I'll give you 40 for, because it's worth 40. And I said, okay. He said, okay. So he says, I'll give you I said, you got to finance it 100%. He said, no problem. And he was like, do you need money for the rehab? I said, no, I have money for the rehab. So, because he actually didn't believe that the properties were worth very much at all. So he didn't really want to lend me much on the rehab. So I said, I got my own rehab money. So I go to closing. It's funny because the way the taxes, property taxes are paid in Florida, they're paid in arrears. And so when I actually went to closing, I actually walked away with a check. I bring nothing to closing. I sign the papers, and then I walk away with a check for several $100s for the taxes, because a full tax year will be due in a few months. So they give me the overage for those taxes. And of course, I owe it I would in 3 or 4 months, I would owe the rest of the money for the whole year. So I walk away with a few $100, and I immediately take the house for $30,000. I call a real estate friend of mine up, and I said, look, I need you to list this house for $40,000 on MLS. I'll give you $1,000. He goes, no problem. A couple of days later, I get a phone call from from an investor, and he says, you want $40,000 for that house? I said, that's right. I said, but you got to close in 10 days. He goes, no problem. He said, I'll buy it for $40,000. I said, great. We go to the closing, whatever. A week later, now I've actually only owned this house about 10 days at this point. Never made a payment. At closing, I walked away with a check. So he buys the house for $40,000. The realtor gets $1,000. Closing costs are maybe $1,000. Balin gets his $30,000 back. I walked away with a check for, I want to say $7,000, $8,000. So I walk away with a check for $8,000. It was 10 days. And okay, fine. So I make $8,000 in 10 days. Only went in the house one time. Disgusting. So that was great. But the other house, I felt like I could probably make some money on this house. Like that, like $8,000. I'm not saying $8,000 is nothing. That's decent money for an 8 days. That's not bad. But So the other house, I definitely felt like there was some money here, even though the interstate was in the way. So anyway, the interstate was between Old Hyde Park and the interstate. Well, I go to that house and I immediately refinance the house. So I get an appraiser to come in. Well, first thing I did with the house was I cleaned up the house. It looked like trash. I had a couple of guys come out, clean up the yard, mow the yard, throw away a bunch of crap in the backyard and the front yard. The grass is growing up. It's ridiculous. It's horrible. I put a new roof on the house, and I had the outside of the house painted. I had the porch painted. Now, and there was a bunch of slats and wood damage and stuff that I had. So I put probably $5,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 in the house within a month. But now it looks pretty good from the outside. So I get an appraiser to come in and appraise the house. He comes in, he looks at the house, he says, okay. He walks inside, he says, man, this place is trashed. I said, yeah, bro, I know it's trashed, but I need you to say on the appraisal that it's good, that it looks good, that it's in fair condition. And of course, this is a guy who does a lot of appraisals for me. So we're cool. He kind of, I don't know, what was his name? I forget the guy's name. Nice guy. Anyway, he's like, and you're going to fix it up? Of course I'm going to, bro, come on. You can trust me. I'm going to fix it up. And I did fix it up. So he gives me this appraisal for the property of like, I forget what he gave it to me, for like $100 and something thousand. Okay. Well, what ends up happening is I refinance the property, I pull out some money, and I pay off Balin. So Balin, literally, I haven't made one payment to Balin yet. So before his first payment's due, I had already refinanced the house, and Balin got all his money back. I've now got maybe $100,000 on the house. I probably walked away with maybe 50 or 60 grand. So I put 50 or 60 grand in the house. I throw a little bit more money into the house. I clean out the entire house. I put in hardwood floors. I fixed the windows. You know, it was in an area that was mixed use. So there was some commercial buildings, but there were still residential buildings. Well, the house gets cleaned up pretty good, and it took a few months for me to do this. I probably worked on that house for about 3 months. Well, after the house is renovated, I have a guy, a realtor, who's actually still a real estate agent in Tampa. So I'm not going to mention his name, but he comes in and he says, Matt, you want to sell that house, right? And I was like, yeah. He said, I got this guy who's a lawyer who wants to buy the house. And I went, okay. He said he just graduated with his law degree, just passed the bar. He was actually working for like a law firm, but he just became a lawyer, like just passed the bar. I don't know, he was working as an intern or something. I don't know. Super nice guy. So we walk through the whole place, and he says, look, I'm going to use this property as my law firm. And I went, okay. And I said, look, you know, he goes, what do you want for it? And I think I said I forget what I said. I just remember we made like $100 grand on the house. I want to say I sold it for $280,000. So I told him that I wanted to make that I wanted to make like, I was supposed to walk away with like 230 grand. Because that way I was still making like $100,000, something like that. So I was like, look, I need to walk away with this much money. He goes, okay. He said, listen, here's the problem. He goes, I don't have a down payment. Like I have very little money. I'm starting my own business. He said, but I have good credit. And I went, okay. So he said, and the real estate agent, the realtor was there. He's like, yeah, bro, I know you can fix it up. I know you can work with this. You can do something. And I was like, okay, I can figure this out. Here's what I'm going to do. He had been working for the law firm, so he had good employment. So I said, all right, you got good employment. He's got good credit and he's got good employment, but didn't have the down payment. So, but he did have like a bank account, with like SunTrust or somebody. I forget exactly who it was, but with SunTrust or someone like that. So what we did was I had him get me his last 2 months bank statements, and I altered the bank statements to show that he had $50,000 in the bank. Then I had him go get a check for like $5,000 or something for for like $5,000, a cashier's check. So he gets a cashier's check for like $5,000. So we take the $5,000 cashier's check and we deposit into the title company. So he still owes $45,000 for his down payment, essentially. His down payment is basically like 20%. And he's buying this house owner occupied. So keep in mind too, this is a lawyer who knows he's committing bank fraud. He's faking his down payment. He knows he's faking his down payment. He knows that he's also committing what's called owner occupancy fraud, which means you're saying you're going to live in a house that you have no intention of living in. So he ends up giving me $5,000 for his down payment. For his like an earnest deposit. So we put that into the title company. Then I have him go get like after we do the appraisal, he gets another check, and I'll explain how that worked. So what I do is I submit him to a lender, and they're like, hey, he's got like 700 credit scores. He has been on his job, and he makes decent enough money. Not great, but decent enough Like, he wasn't a lawyer at that time. He was just kind of like an intern or well, whatever. He was working as a paralegal or something. So he's doing okay. So, but he had enough money he made enough money to debt, what's called debt to income ratio, made enough money to qualify for the mortgage, provided he put down 20%. The bank statements that I provided made it look like he has the 20%. He's already put down $5,000, which was honestly like all the money he had, but it doesn't appear that way on the bank statements. Well, so now we have to order the appraisal. He's already got a pre-approval. We have to order the appraisal. So we order the appraisal, but this time when the appraiser comes out, I say, I need it to appraise at 280. Now my appraiser is like, man, I just appraised this thing at like 150,000 or 120,000, whatever he had brought it into a month or 3 months earlier. And I was like, I know, but I need to come in at 280. And so I tell him, I need you to use the comparables for the properties on the other side of the interstate in Old Hyde Park. And he's like, I can't jump the interstate. And there's a problem with jumping a main thoroughfare or a major body. And like an interstate or the toll road or toll interstate or whatever you want to call it is an issue. And he was like, I can't do that. And I explained to him, just to give me the appraisal. Well, he can do it, but he was saying it'll be an issue. So he gives me the appraisal, but there's the interstate's running through it. So I actually take, back then you actually got, and you still do, you actually get a map of the area, right? It's like a drawn out map of the area. So I went through and I removed the interstate, because when they review the appraisal, they're going to have a problem that this interstate is here. The underwriters are going to look at the appraisal. They'll be like, yeah, there are 3 comparables, and yes, it's worth 280, but the issue here is that all the comparables are half a mile away on the other side of an interstate. So I went in and I cut and pasted out the interstate. So I removed the interstate and I put a couple of houses there, and I removed the whole thing, and I put it back into the appraisal, and I send them the appraisal. They end up doing what's called a desktop review, where they only really what they check is, are these houses in the area? Do they substantiate the value of this home? So they did a desktop review, and they said, yeah, it's clearly worth $180,000. So the day of closing, so the appraisal passes. My lawyer client passes. He doesn't have his down payment though. So the day of closing, he has to come up with a check for, let's say, $45,000. I'm paying all of his closing costs in the contract, which is perfectly legal. But he's supposed to show up with, let's say, for the sake of argument, $45,000, which is his like 20% down payment, roughly. So I tell him, go get me a check for, like $45. Whatever the exact amount was, $45,212. So I tell him, go give me a check for $45 and, $200 or $2 or just $45, whatever. So he goes and he gets a cashier's check for that amount from his bank account. I take the cashier's check and I change it so that it shows that it looks like the $45,212 or whatever it was supposed to be that he's supposed to show up at the closing for his down payment. I then go to my bank and I get a cashier's check for the exact same amount. I then make a copy of his cashier's check that was taken from his bank account, but the altered one, and I send it to the lender. I send it to the lender. I then deposit my cashier's check from my bank with the correct amount, and I ask the title company for a letter showing that the money was deposited. They show that it's deposited. I send that off to the lender. So the lender thinks that his check was deposited for $45,000, when in fact it was my check that was deposited for $45,000. They can't call and check with his bank. They can't get a copy of his bank statements. Plus, it doesn't matter. I've already given him copies of the bank statements showing that he's had this money in the bank for several months. So they believe it's his money. Then we do the closing, all the title work, all the closing statements show that he put down $5,000. They have the cashier's check. That was 2 weeks ago. It shows that he put down an additional $45,000. They have the cashier's check. You can see it. They have a letter from the title company. Plus, they have the closing statement that shows he put down $45,000. We go to closing. We sign the document. I, of course, get a check back for $150,000 or $160,000 or whatever it was. And of course, $50,000 of that was the down payment that had come from me anyway, with the exception of the $5,000. I think he did put down $5,000, and he put down a little bit, not much though. So I end up making about $100,000 on that transaction. Here's the funny thing about that. Like, that guy literally moved into that property. He moved his law office into that property. He put like a parking lot in the back, like an asphalt parking lot in the back of it, ran his law firm out of that building for like 18 years. And only about 4 or 5, maybe 6 months ago, bulldozed the whole thing, and it's a vacant lot now. They're about to build something brand new there. The guy stayed there the whole time, made all the payments. He's actually became a very successful attorney. But that whole transaction is fraud. Like, that whole transaction's fraud. But he made all the payments. Now, so anyway, my buddy, when I was talking, he's like, bro, that's interesting. Like, the way, you did all that to come up with this, to get the money to do this, and that it was a lawyer. The thing is, though, like, I remember saying to him, well, I'm like, why? Because there's a lawyer. He's like, yeah, because people wouldn't think a lawyer would do that. I was like, are you serious? I've done fake loans for Tampa police officers, for sheriff's deputies, for lawyers, for doctors. I mean, I've done for all kinds of people that you would think would never be involved in something like that. I've done CPAs. I've done all kinds of tax attorneys. I've done all kinds of fraudulent. So this guy, it didn't even faze me. But what's interesting about it is, yeah, it was fraud, but the guy did make all of his payments. I mean, it's still fraud, but the guy made all of his payments and supposedly probably paid off the loan. It was a 30-year mortgage. He probably paid it off a long time ago or refinanced it or whatever he did. So anyway, I thought that'd be an interesting story. My buddy was like, bro, you got to do something like that. It's super interesting that the way you did this and did that. I didn't think it was that interesting, but whatever. So the point is, if you like the video, do me a favor and subscribe to the station. Do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell. Hit the notification button. Notification bell. It's a notification bell. Share the video. Leave a comment for the algorithm. And send the video to like 5 or 10 of your friends. Tell them about me because I'm all right. And tell them to check out the channel. And see ya.